I'm Simon Hancock, and I'm delighted you can join me this evening. Tonight is a very important anniversary in the criminal history of Pembrokeshire. It's exactly 200 years today that the last person was hanged in Pembrokeshire. And that person was William Roblin, who achieved a striking notoriety because he was the last person to be executed at Haverfordwest Castle on Easter Monday, 1821. Now, his story has been much quoted. There's been lots of different versions of his life and crimes. Those penned in Victorian times by W.D. Phillips. There was Charles Sinnett, B.G. Charles, G. Douglas James, and latterly in 1997 by Andrew Roberts. There seems to be nothing new to say. But with history, there is no finished article. It is never a picture of complete veracity. There's always something new to bring to the table, because when we look into the pages of history, we see through a glass darkly. There's always something else, new information, or indeed new interpretations that can be brought to bear. So the Roblin story is one of the best local examples of where fact and fiction effortlessly merge to create a version of events which surprisingly is not accurate in many aspects. Historical accounts are subject to the possibility of new information and the discovery of new material. Our knowledge of the Roblin story has actually made a remarkable advance forwards in the discovery of a comprehensive account of his life and times in a newspaper article published by the Haverfordwest and Milford Haven Telegraph in 1863, in a column entitled Pembrokeshire Murders. Now, this was a sensational discovery, unknown to previous authors, because it talks of events and people that are completely missing from every previous narrative of telling the story. We have more information, and this new account is obviously important because there were many people alive in 1863 who were involved in Roblin 40 years before. Now, we trace the life of William Roblin way back to that lovely rural idyll in Marteltwy in the year 1776, the year in which the American colonists declared their independence from George III. And in this little corner of Pembrokeshire, William Roblin was born to a modest farmer, a poor farmer called Richard Roblin, and his wife Elizabeth. Now, Richard Roblin was born in 1740, and he married Elizabeth Jeffreys at Narberth in 1772. No record of William Roblin's baptism has survived, adding to the sense of his origins being murky and mysterious. Most inhabitants of the parish eked out a living from the land, with the small local collieries employed men and women, and indeed children. We know absolutely nothing of William Roblin's early years, except of his precious moral condemnation later heaped upon him. It was alleged how his early days were passed in the society of the most dissolute and profligate companions, amongst whom drunkenness, blasphemy, and the desecration of the Sabbath by cockfighting, dogfighting, and outdoor gambling. These activities were carried out to an extent and with a recklessness of all social and moral obligations unknown and even undreamt of to the present generation of Pembrokeshire people. So my goodness me, what a very round condemnation of his character. Now, this early unattributed account of Roblin's early years described how he was imbued with those pernicious and soul-polluting characteristics which played such a later part in his career and ultimately brought him to an inglorious end. It seems certain that William Roblin, a yeoman, did imbibe a great deal. It's easy for us today in 2021 to moralise and condemn those practices. Much less encountered was an examination of why people perhaps did turn to drink. It was usually a response to squalid living conditions, environmental standards. Basically, people drank. It was a temporary release from their misery. In industrial areas of northern England, the consumption of wine, beer, and spirits was known as the road out of Manchester, an effectual, short-term remedy from polluting squalor and unremitting poverty. Now, we know that William Roblin was possessed of a fiery temper, which, when combined with drink, caused him to be discharged from more than one employer. By 1814, William Roblin was employed as a servant, probably of the agricultural kind rather than a house servant. His employer was a man called Richard Barzi, whose family had lived at Arnall's Hill in the parish of Slebich since at least 1714. Later, the property was acquired by the Baron de Robertson. Now, according to this hitherto unpublished Victorian account of the murder, Barzi was frequently called upon to remonstrate with Roblin on account of his brutal treatment of animals on the farm. His species of ferocity was apparently visited upon these dumb creatures, especially after he had consumed large quantities of ale. Mr. Barzi had enough of his errant employee and threatened William Roblin with instant dismissal unless he mended his ways. However, Mr. Barzi was not able to put this into effect. He died suddenly at Arnall's Hill in the parish of Slebich on the 17th of February, 1814, aged 71. Now, there is no evidence of foul play and no cause of death can be ascribed, although some rumour mongers said, and I quote, it was under suspicious circumstances. Further, a portion of his cash, which he kept in his house, mysteriously disappeared at the same time. Now, the corrosive effect of rumour and innuendo, not for the first time, ate away at William Roblin's reputation. They had the cumulative effect of making the black legend, which is still with us today. Did Roblin kill his employer and use some of the stolen money to set up on his own account? It seems unlikely, but we will never know for certain. While at Arnall's Hill farm, Roblin met his future wife Margaret, who was also in service there. Margaret Thomas, as she was then, was baptised at Loreni Church on the 5th of May, 1776, the daughter of Martha and Maurice Thomas. The couple had courted and they married the following year. Their marriage took place at St. Petrock's Church, where the Norman Tower stands out in proud isolation facing towards the Castle Martin Peninsula. They married by licence on the 22nd of October, 1815, and William Roblin of Mountain was described as a yeoman, while Margaret was simply described as a spinster. At 38 years of age, Margaret would have been considered very old for the marriage market, although of course she was the same age as her husband. Soon after their nuptials, they took a lease of a small farm at Deep Lake in Usmaston Parish, 3 miles from Haverfordwest, on the turnpike road between Haverfordwest and Carmarthen. They also ran a public house in a small thatched dwelling on the farm. Alehouse licences show how John Page opened an alehouse at the bottom of Arnall's Hill in 1811. He was still there in 1815, and he was probably succeeded by William Roblin as licensee in either late 1815 or early 1816. At any rate, by Michaelmas 1819, the farmhouse was called Homebound, probably an abbreviation for Homeward Bound, a sign calculated to appeal to weary country folk on their way home from market and then faced with the daunting sight of a very steep climb up Arnall's Hill. For this clarification, we are indebted to Keith Johnson of Cresswell Quay for his voluminous history of Pembrokeshire public houses. For many years, Roblin's Inn was erroneously described as the New Inn. This name, in fact, appeared 40 years after Roblin's death, and even then the name of the inn was the Carpenter's Arms before that, and it stood near the Picton Castle Lodge Gate. It's just an example of how misinformation has been reported and sort of down the generations, and it simply is not the truth. Now, in the 4 years or so that William Roblin, yeoman, innkeeper and contractor, lived at Deep Lake, he attracted an unenviable reputation. He allegedly pursued a course of dissipation and lawless disturbance towards whom he considered his enemies, or who had given him a cause for offence, no matter how slight. He became the terror and the dread of the neighbourhood, who seemingly ostracised him and his wife. Now, despite their late marriage, Margaret gave birth to 2 children. Their first child was very possibly a son named Isaac, who died when he was only 2 months old. A second child, a daughter named Martha, was born at Deep Lake in the year 1818 and was described as a sweet and interesting girl in her 4th year at the time of her father's execution. The Homebound was a veritable vortex, sucking in vicious tales of murder and debauchery. Many of the reports in circulation centred upon Roblin's drunken conduct and the extreme looseness with which the house was managed. One popular and persistent rumour centred upon an Irish hawker who visited the house and stayed over, and apparently was never ever seen again. The Irishman's sudden and singular disappearance added much to Roblin's ill fame, and it was broadly asserted how Roblin had murdered his guest, buried the body, and had stolen his money. One of the most damning aspects of Roblin's character, and this was a very religious age, was his antipathy to religion. The author of a contemporary pamphlet, Richard Grimes, contains a reference to Roblin's desire to join Lord Milford's auxiliary cavalry. Now, this military unit was paid for and sponsored by the peer of Picton Castle. When he was asked why he wanted to become a volunteer soldier, Roblin replied, acidly, to pull down all the damned meeting houses. He added how he could take care of his own salvation, and he didn't need any references to the services of those damned preachers. So that was seen as a very, very black mark against his character, his antipathy to the Christian religion. Now, life is full of strange ironies and unexpected occurrences. Roblin supplemented his farming, more properly his smallholding and innkeeping, by carting materials for local farmers and builders. On one occasion, he was employed carting stones to the castle at Haverfordwest, where a new prison was being built in the grounds. In the summer of 1820, the work on the new jail was well underway. During his haulage work, Roblin was noted for his inhumanity towards the horses, together with his coarse and uncouth language. His workmates were then, of course, in the course of building the drop, where executions would take place. And on one occasion, we're told, Roblin beat his disobedient horse so that Mr. Thomas Jones, who was the governor of Haverfordwest Castle, felt constrained to warn him that if he observed a repeat of this conduct, he would personally take Roblin before a magistrate and have him severely punished. Roblin acerbically replied that it was his own horse. Nevertheless, he never repeated his brutal actions in the sight of Thomas Jones. Now, on Friday, the 18th of August, 1820, William Roblin was employed bringing a load of coals to the county jail. He was heavily intoxicated at the time, and he was warned about driving in that unfit state. He angrily retorted, "I like a drop to drink, and I will have it and take no one's leave." On that same day, a man named William Davies, aged 23, who had formerly been employed by William Roblin, was engaged in carting ashes from the residence of Mrs. Smith, confectioner in High Street, Haverfordwest. A great deal of bad blood existed between the two men on account of Roblin's habits and because Roblin owed Davies arrears of wages. Now, the victim in this crime, William Davies, is far from a sympathetic character. He was described as a man of a most singular and sinister countenance, and was of a brutal disposition himself. He had, in fact, served a prison sentence for a particularly odious crime. On the 10th of March 1818, he entered the county jail, which was then within the walls of the medieval castle, having been convicted of flaying a calf while it was still alive. He served a year in custody and was released on the 23rd of March 1819. Presumably after that, he entered Robbin Service. On the 19th of August 1820, Both men encountered one another at the Cartlet lime kilns. A vicious slagging match erupted over the matter of the outstanding wages. Roblin and Davies almost came to blows and were prevented to do so by one of the lime burners who was working there. Both left town in the direction of Slebich. Both were heavily intoxicated, and a couple of miles outside town, they resumed their quarrel. Davies challenged Roblin to a fight. Roblin went into his own house. What happened next is disputed, with two very differing accounts. After William Davies left Robbin Service, he was engaged by Thomas of Bolston. Later that day, according to one account, the two men were walking past Roblin's cottage. Roblin and Davies began a heated exchange, which culminated in Roblin rushing back inside his house to retrieve a pistol with which he shot Davies in the head. The whole shocking affair was witnessed by Thomas, who lost no time in reporting this to the authorities. Now, a differing account of how Davies came to be shot argues how Davies was banging on Roblin's door, threatening and offering all sorts of insults and challenges. Margaret Robin, Roblin's wife, went outside and desperately tried to persuade Davies to go away, fearful of her husband's explosive temper, especially in drink. Roblin rushed outside, and in a scuffle, a shot rang out. Instantly, Davies was stretched on the ground, insensible and welting in his own blood. Whatever the precise circumstances, it's clear that cries of murder rang out soon after, and Davies was still alive, although critically ill. Davies was taken to the Haverfordwest surgeon, George Llewellyn Millard, later became Mayor of Haverfordwest in the 1840s, a man who considered speed in the execution of surgery as essential. These were the days before anaesthetic, and it must have been recognised instantly that Davies, with a very severe head wound, would have no possibility of survival. Now, recovering very quickly from his state of intoxication, Roblin soon realised what he'd done, and he fled the scene. Did his wife Margaret assist him in his flight, and thus make herself an accomplice to the deed? Roblin knew the countryside well and concealed himself at a number of different locations in the country. Now, the law enforcement agencies, such as they were, only consisted of the Usmaston parish constables, George Evans, Joseph Perkins, and they set off in pursuit of Roblin. They were assisted by Dennis Corker and Levi Griffiths, who was sworn in before the Reverend James Thomas of St Mary's Church, Haverfordwest, to be special constables. Another constable, Thomas Jenkins, joined the search on the 3rd of September 1820. Now, according to one account, Roblin fled to a place called Tyborne in Marteltwy, his home parish. He stayed at the house of John Thomas and his daughter Margaret, a fugitive from justice. One of Roblin's pursuers, Levi Griffiths, had had a most interesting military career. He had served in the British Army throughout the Peninsular War against Napoleon, and he'd participated in the famous retreat by Sir John Moore to Corunna in 1809. And Griffiths lived at Priory-style Cottage, which stood at the bottom of Union Hill in Haverfordwest, and he died there in 1864 at a ripe old age. The constables searched for William Roblin for 18 days, and all in vain. They couldn't find him. Of course, there was no police force in these days. The first police forces in the history of Pembrokeshire were in the 1830s. 1835, the Municipal Corporation Act allowed boroughs, Haverfordwest, Tenby, to appoint their own police forces. Haverfordwest police force was only 3 people, and the police force in Tenby was 2. They were untrained, not professional, and so it took many, many decades before there to be any semblance at all of a professional law enforcement agency in Pembrokeshire. Now, the searchers were encouraged and directed to find Roblin by none other than Lord Milford of Pembrokeshire Castle himself. It's a very interesting involvement which may have played a decisive role in Roblin's fate. On one occasion, the constables arrived at a cottage near Silver Hill, a farm where Roblin's father, Richard, kept. It was here that Richard Roblin, Sr., would have left food for his son at predetermined places in Canaston Woods. Upon arriving at the cottage, the woman occupant hesitated to open the doors, fearful it might be Roblin. He had already assumed the mantle of the local bogeyman. While the two constables remained in conversation with the old woman, she seemed genuinely terrified about the supposed proximity of Roblin to her cottage. She promised the constables faithfully every possible assistance, and she would report Roblin if she caught sight of him. Now, on the 18th day of the search, Griffiths and Corker caught sight of Roblin in Canaston Woods, walking amongst the trees and the undergrowth. They chased him and called upon him to surrender. He ran like a frightened deer, and so they discharged their firearms at him. The pistols were loaded with ball, which they fired 3 times each. The weapon was not terribly accurate, especially at a running target shielded by numerous trees. They lost him again, and he went to ground. Lord Milford offered a bounty of 40 guineas, an unusually large gratuity, although the constables failed to locate him. They did eventually receive a consolation of 5 guineas each on account of their valiant endeavours. Interestingly, Roblin later recounted a tale told from his prison cell of how he was actually in that cottage in Silver Hill when the 2 parish constables were talking to the old woman. Apparently, she had already willingly provided him with sanctuary. He was hiding under the floorboards, covered with a dusty old bag, and was close enough to have taken one of the constables' hats off their head. As with so much of this tale, how he came to be apprehended is disputed. He was taken on the 4th of September 1820, whilst away from his hiding place at Tyborne. The newly discovered account paints a different picture of his apprehension. On the day in which the special constables shot at Roblin, Roblin was a man in absolute, utter despair and desperation. He left his hiding place of his own volition, and he gave himself up to a farmer named Mr. Phillips, who farmed at Maryborough in the parish of Wiston. He begged the farmer to take him to Haverfordwest in his cart, covered with straw, so that he might be spared the malevolence of the local population. The request was complied with, and William Roblin was delivered into the custody of Thomas Jones, the prison governor. He was committed to Haverfordwest Jail on the 5th of September 1820, charged with battery because William Davies was still clinging to life. After languishing for 3 weeks, William Davies died on the 13th of September 1820, and the charge that Roblin was indicted for immediately became one, not of battery, but of willful murder. 2 days later, an inquest was held into the death of William Davies before Henry Stokes, the coroner, at Deep Lake. It is interesting to note that this Henry Stokes was the father of the future Admiral Stokes, and he dwelt at Scotch Wells. And as we know with Admiral Stokes, he was on the Beagle, the famous voyage in the 1830s with none other than Charles Darwin. Now at the inquest, the jurymen included solid Pembrokeshire yeomen like Henry Adams, David Beddoe and John Newt. They found that William Roblin, late of the parish of Usmaston, and Margaret, his wife, not having the fear of God before their eyes, but moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil on the 19th of August 1820, whereby William Roblin used a certain pistol of the value of 5 shillings. I've always found that strange, why the value of the pistol was something that was significant, that he used a pistol to the value of 5 shillings to shoot Davies with a leaden ball so as to penetrate his brain. Further, Margaret, the wife of William Roblin, was found to have feloniously, wilfully, and of malice aforethought was present abetting, aiding, assisting, comforting, and maintaining a husband in the commission of the crime. Suspicion had long fallen on Margaret Roblin as being an accomplice. She fled from her house at Deep Lake, and she was at large for 2 days before she was detained by Constables Evans, Perkins, and Jenkins. Presumably, the couple's daughter Martha must have been with her mother whilst she was a fugitive. Margaret Roblin was taken into custody on the 15th of September 1820 on suspicion of having committed a felony. On that same day, at Usmaston Churchyard, William Davies, aged 23, was buried in a service conducted by the Reverend George Phillips. And the wound which caused his death was obvious. At the post-mortem, George Llewellyn Millard had opened up his head, abdomen, and thorax. On the 18th of September 1820, William Roblin was riveted at the county jail, and he was placed in Ward 7. Was this the old prison, or could this have been the new prison, possibly have been partly occupied by then? Margaret Roblin was ensconced in Ward 1, along with a little daughter Martha. Prison life was particularly arduous and stressful, especially given the nature of the offences with which they were facing. Early 19th century justice did not lack a hard edge. On the 18th of February 1821, William Harris of Dew Street, who was a surgeon to the county jail, entered Margaret Roblin on the sick list with bilious fever. He prescribed a special diet for her of white bread, milk, and even a bottle of wine. William Roblin, too, fell ill. He was entered on the sick list on Friday, the 23rd of February, 1821, again from an attack of fever. He had sufficiently recovered by the 4th of March to be recovered from the sick list, and we only have a sketchy idea of his thoughts and actions in prison over the 7-month period. There was certainly no contact permitted between husband and wife. In conversations with visitors and priests, Roblin strenuously denied killing William Davies, or indeed that he ever owned a pistol, although he certainly did. One question never posed in the earlier accounts of this story is what became of the murder weapon? Did he cast it into the eastern Cleddau, or did he bury it in Caniston Woods, never to be recovered? Sometimes Roblin would indulge in horseplay with the warders or the guards, but other times he was very conscious of the dreadful position he found himself in. On the 16th of April 1821, the day before his trial, with tears in his eyes, he asked the prison governor if he could see his little daughter Martha, saying, "I shall never see her again." His daughter was being kept in another part of the prison with her mother. Now, Thomas Jones was a local Methodist. He was a very compassionate and kind man, and he did allow this request. At seeing and parting Martha, he showed the tenderest paternal feelings, strong proof, as one account said, that Roblin's heart was not deadened to the holiest and brightest flower that can bloom in the breast of a father. His love for his innocent offspring ruled his wayward and erring nature. Now, the spring great sessions for the county of Pembrokeshire, where the most serious criminal cases were heard, was held at the old Guildhall at the top of High Street, near St Mary's Church, on Tuesday, the 17th of April, 1821. Here, the calendar of criminal cases, and we have another image of this, included the names of William and Margaret Roblin, who were jointly charged with murdering William Davies. Now, other indictments were for crimes of highway robbery, smuggling, theft, and even poisoning. The evidence of witnesses and other vital testimony is sadly not recorded. Evidence was produced, obviously, by Thomas of the parish of Bolston, who was in every respect the key witness. Since on the 6th of September, 1820, he entered into a recognizance of £20, promising to personally appear and give evidence at the great sessions of jail delivery to give evidence against William Roblin. The trial was presided over by judges John Balguy and Samuel Hayward. George Llewellyn Millard, the surgeon, proved that the cause of death was a pistol bullet which penetrated Davies's skull in one place and came out another. Writing in 1863, the author of this sadly anonymous article wrote how he had actually seen the head of the deceased on more than one occasion. The mortal wound was 1 inch wide and 3 inches deep. According to the Cambrian newspaper, the first Welsh newspaper for the country was published in 1804, and that was the Cambrian. And of course, cases of murder, and sensational occurrences, newspapers covered then as they would today. And according to the Cambrian newspaper, the facts appeared so clear against the prisoner that the jury had no hesitation in pronouncing him guilty. And then the learned judge, after a very affecting address, sentenced him to suffer death on Monday, the 23rd of April, 1821. Then his corpse was to be dissected and anatomized. Probably no evidence was offered against Margaret Roblin, and she was acquitted of the charges. What is remarkable to modern minds is the exceptionally short period between sentence and execution, just a matter of a few days. Today, of course, in countries like the United States, where they still have the death penalty, decades can pass between the sentence of death being pronounced and somebody's execution after having exhausted every possible legal and judicial avenue to get clemency or a commutation of the sentence. But with this, he was sentenced on one day and literally hanged the next day. It's remarkable. And of course, what seems unjust to 21st century minds is that Roblin almost certainly would have had no legal counsel. Facing a capital charge, he would have unless you could afford legal representation, you would probably have been unrepresented. And so it seems unfair, but that was the nature of justice in 1821 and is a different world to the one that we live in ourselves. According to the 1863 narrative, there's a slightly different twist to the tale. Bearing in mind the violent and argumentative nature of the deceased, the jury, according to this anonymous account, declined to return a verdict of willful murder, but only one of manslaughter, since there'd been an element of provocation. The judges, allegedly, were not prepared to accept this verdict, and they peremptorily directed the jurymen to find the charge of willful murder. They complied under the most extraordinary species of coercion. Now, if this really did happen, and we will never know for sure, was it at the instigation of powerful people? This is pure conjecture, there's no evidence, but could it have possibly, this is a wild theory, could it have been anything to do with the influence of Lord Milford, who perhaps felt that his family honour had been besmirched by a homicide that had been committed in his own backyard? But the author of the 1863 narrative asserted that the jury didn't want to find him guilty of willful murder, and manslaughter, he would probably have been imprisoned, but he would have kept his life. Upon sentence of death, Roblin shuddered convulsively, and for a moment or two his features, it is said that he reflected the livid hue of death. He was fearfully agitated, and every bodily faculty was terribly prostrated. He was removed from the dock and from thence to prison, aided by Thomas Jones, the governor, and another person named Morris, one on either side. Between the sentence of death and the execution, Roblin spent many hours in the company of local clergy and indeed nonconformist ministers as well from the town's various denominations. They visited this desperate man, and after whose careful and soothing admonitions and Christian exertions, he became reconciled to his fate. On the evening of the trial, Roblin was visited by the Reverend Thomas Rogers, a Wesleyan Methodist minister, who found the condemned man full of enmity against his accusers. Roblin was under the closest scrutiny lest he avoid the sentence of the court by harming himself. On one occasion, he was found to have concealed iron pins in the sleeve of his jacket with the intention of piercing his veins in different places and bleeding to death. Roblin stated, "Justice has not done me, but I shall have justice in another world." The Reverend David Adams, the Reverend James Thomas, and the prison ordinary and others visited Roblin in his cell. The Reverend Daniel Waugh of the Tabernacle Chapel once told Roblin that he had but a short time to live. Roblin wept and said, "A man is a long time coming up, and now I will be cut off in a moment." He once confided in the Mr. J. Lewis, the undersheriff, how he had struck Davis with a pistol, but he denied that it was intentional. The execution was fixed for Monday, the 23rd of April, 1821, and it was Easter Monday, 200 years ago to this very day. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the Reverend David Adams and another person entered the condemned cell. The clergyman read a portion of the 55th chapter from Isaiah, after which Roblin called for a pen, ink, and paper. He had eaten but little since Friday, and he had terrible pain in his stomach. He called for tobacco, since he liked smoking. The Reverend Adams asked him candidly about the Irishman, whom he was rumoured to have murdered at the farm. Roblin answered with the composure of a man fully aware of his situation and replied to the Reverend Adams, "I am clear of that. Why should I conceal it now? They can do no more to me," meaning that he was going to be hanged anyway, and he had nothing to lose by making a full confession. He said, "I always liked that Irishman. He was fond of drink, he was good company, and he always paid very well. I have been guilty of swearing, drinking, and of Sabbath breaking, but I am not guilty of his death." There is, not surprisingly, given the twists and turns of this story, some confusion as to the site of Roblin's execution. In 1821 and in 1824, the jailer's diary and the visiting book mention a drop in the tower being in some need of repair, which is strange given the building was only 3 or 4 years old. If the tower with the drop was to fall, it went on, it would hit the houses in Bridge Street. The problem is compounded by reports that the site was at the castle gate and that people watched the execution from the back of their houses in Dark Street and indeed High Street. It seems clear to me that the public execution did indeed take place on the bank overlooking where Castle Lake car park is today. Now, the Reverend David Adams, to whom there is a memorial chapel, a tablet, in Haverfordwest St. Isles Church, wrote down Roblin's dying sentiments, and I quote, "William Roblin, as a dying man, and in the prospect of eternity, is desirous of parting out of this miserable world in love and charity with all mankind. He freely, fully, and heartily forgives all those to whom he may have considered his enemies, and he hopes for forgiveness at the hands of God. His heart's desire to God is that he will look with particular mercy upon and protect his poor wife and little girl. He hoped his fate would be an example to others so that they might earnestly avoid drunkenness, intemperate passions." On the day of his execution, he received the sacrament, and we have an excerpt of the account book showing, and this was given to him by the Reverend James Thomas, the prison chaplain, and he was paid 1 shilling and 4p by the prison authorities for giving Roblin the sacrament before his execution. The execution was attended by the High Sheriff of Pembrokeshire, Joseph Harris of Llanonwas, and it was one of the less appealing responsibilities of the High Sheriff in those days to supervise executions. Fortunately, executions in Pembrokeshire were very, very rare. There was an execution in 1801, a 17-year-old lad, David Duckfield, who'd murdered a girl. 1811, John Griffith, who had murdered 2 of his wives through arsenic poisoning, and of course William Roblin in 1821. Roblin was accompanied to a chamber on one side of the stairs leading to the fatal spot. presumably a specially constructed platform. He was pinioned by the executioner, and the executioner was disguised. Although Roblin looked into his eyes, he was probably wearing a mask, but he could see his eyes. And it says in this 1863 account, he looked in his eyes and he recognized him. And he said, I thought it would come to this. There were 18 applications for the post of hangman. Obviously, it was a one-off responsibility, but how they advertised it in the town, I don't know. But it drew 18 applications for this rather unsavoury work. And in 1863, it said that the person who hanged Roblin was still alive, although his identity had never and would never be revealed. Rumour has become rife that Roblin, even at this stage, might daringly make an attempt to escape. So Mr. Blethyn, a local blacksmith, was employed to erect a strong iron railing around the platform, around which the sheriff's javelin men were placed in serried array. A huge concourse of people had gathered to witness Roblin's execution, the first in town for 10 years. When asked at the last if he'd anything to say, he replied, "No, I have nothing to say. I suppose you want me to confess to murders of which I am not guilty." And there was another reference to the dogged rumours that he'd murdered the Irishman. He resumed his prayers. "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then silence as the drop fell. A few throes of apparent pain had passed over his frame, and that was all that remained of William Roblin, was the ghastly spectacle of his inanimate corpse, suspended between heaven and earth. Who was the last surviving person to witness William Roblin? There would have been hundreds, possibly even thousands of people witnessed to see his execution. But in subsequent obituaries and published memoirs of older residents, published between 1850 and 1910, not a single person references to seeing the execution of William Roblin. A child of 10 could have seen William Roblin hang in 1821 and have lived up to the time of the First World War. A very strange collective lack of local memory. To give you some indication, in 1753, Edward Lee was hanged at Haverfordwest for breaking into a house and stealing some silver goods. It was said that 20,000 people saw his demise. So these things would have been enormous draws, and there's even some accounts of people, opportunistic, if nothing else, renting out rooms in High Street and Dark Street by the hour, so they'd have pole position and a bird's eye view of the execution, which is quite a grim thing to do. Now, Margaret Robin was released from prison with her daughter on the 21st of April, 2 days before the execution. At the very least, she was an indirect participant in the crime. The body of her husband was given over to George Llewellyn Millard. Another account says that the corpse was given to William Harris for dissection and anatomization. It was afterwards stated how Mr. Millard thought Roblin's skeleton was the most perfect in every part and form that had fallen under his expert medical inspection. Later, Roblin's remains were buried within the precincts of Haverfordwest Castle. But the execution of William Roblin was not quite the end of the story. On Tuesday, the 7th of May, 1821, William Llewellyn of Rosehill, Usmaston, wrote a letter of concern to a local magistrate, alluding to some particulars of the report which have been so long afloat about the death of the Irishman at Deep Lake. Several persons had witnessed Richard Roblin, William's father, talking loudly about the Irishman who was murdered at his son's house. For a premium of £5, he stated he could show inquiries this body and also the body of another unknown female victim. One of the bodies was buried in the cabbage patch to the rear of the cottage at Deep Lake. It seems to me that Richard Roblin was being grimly humorous by testing the credulity of those who would believe any sort of wickedness against his son. John Thomas of Tyborne told William Llewellyn how Roblin, when he stayed with him as a fugitive from justice, confessed in drink how he'd once buried a woman's body under or near a pear tree in the orchard. Roblin issued a braggart oath that he knew where the Irishman was buried. Bailiff William Rigards sent 5 witnesses, the overseers, churchwardens, to assemble at Deep Lake in response to Llewellyn's information on Tuesday, the 16th of May, 1821. A number of labourers were required to dig up the orchard there in search of the 2 supposed victims of Roblin's psychopathic rage. The coroner, Henry Stokes, also was in attendance. The next day, the labourers also dug up the clay pit in search of bodies. They dug extensively, but nothing whatever was found. Not a vestige of human remains was encountered, and I think William Roblin would have been highly amused. The author of the 1863 narrative considered how Roblin suffered from a gross act of injustice, which would not have been allowed decades later. Davies's death was not premeditated, but could be argued to be manslaughter. Excessive drink and inflamed passions on both sides were made worse by taunts and insults from Davies. The conduct and language of the deceased was of an exceptionally aggravating nature. The jury was ruthlessly overruled, and a sentence of death was practically forced upon them. It was a mercy that the cruel system of tyrannical direction of dictation was abolished soon afterwards. Now, speaking to the author of a pamphlet about Roblin, a man called Richard Grimes, and his pamphlet is entitled Murder and Death, Effects of Drunkenness, or a brief memoir of William Roblin. Margaret Robin, the widow, confessed drink was the cause of all of this. William was as quiet as any man when he was not drunk, but when he'd imbibed, he offended other people, and that is why everyone turned against him. Now, the 1863 narrative is giving a version of events that is very sympathetic to Roblin. I suppose, as in any other case, we have the traditional version, we have the 1863 version, and possibly the truth lies somewhere a bit more nuanced between the two. Traditional accounts of this sad story normally end with William Roblin's execution. No one sought out the fate of his wife and his child. They must have been deeply traumatized and haunted by the experience, and undoubtedly shunned and treated like pariahs. Margaret Roblin, once tried for murder, must have spawned many lurid tales and rumours herself. She must have kept a very low, if not invisible, profile for many years after. On the 17th of June 1837, Martha Roblin, her daughter, was married to Lewis John at Slebridge Church. William and Margaret's daughter were both illiterate and were only able to make their mark. The witnesses were Thomas and William John. It is not even clear whether Margaret was even present. A void of nearly 30 years covers the movements of Margaret Roblin. There is no record of her in the 1841 census for Wales, with anyone bearing that name. Where did Margaret Roblin go? We know that her only daughter Martha, son-in-law Lewis, and their children were living at Bolston in 1841. Did Margaret live under assumed name and live away until the dust well and truly settled from the terrible events of 1820, 1821? The next definite sign of Margaret Roblin comes in 1851, a full 30 years after her husband's execution, when the 76-year-old laundress was living on St. Thomas's Green, Haverfordwest, and the household there consisted of 2 other people, Elizabeth Jones, a 60-year-old laundress, and a retired grocer named Francis Allen. By 1861, Lewis John and his wife Martha and their children William, probably named after her father, aged 20, a shipwright, Elizabeth, Maria, Lewis, Stephen and Charles were all living at New Penna in the parish of St Mary in Pembroke. Margaret Roblin, then aged 84, that's an exceptionally good age for the 19th century, was also living with them. She must have been overjoyed at the very end of her life to be living in the bosom of her growing family after so much disgrace, hardships, and years of exile. Margaret Roblin died in January 1862, possibly buried at Park Cemetery in Pembrokeshire. At the time of researching this talk, I was thinking about the future generations. What happened to Martha? Martha died in 1895, when she herself was an old woman at the age of 77. She must surely have reflected and remembered some of the awful trauma of her childhood. The stigma of being a murderer's daughter would have been difficult to overestimate, although, as I've said, the facts now are capable of disputation. Did Martha have any memories at all of her father? If she did, they would have been mere fragments of memory, a distant echo stretching back 74 years. Martha was truly a tragic, innocent victim of terrible circumstances. William Roblin was destined never to rest in peace. Around 1860, when alterations were being done to the prison in Haverfordwest, his body was exhumed and, remarkably, not offered to his still living widow. They were offered for sale, and he was sold to a sailor as a mere trinket or curiosity. The family had no say on what happened to his remains. Roblin had paid for his crime with his life, and a decent resting place was denied him. Later on, the Alderman William Williams of Haverfordwest chemist bought the skeleton for 1 shilling and 4p. In May 1914, Dr. Williams of St. David's had Roblin's remains moved to his house, a very grisly reminder of a crime 100 years before. The remains were placed in a box and delivered in a cardboard box to St. David's by an errand boy. No one thought of asking the ethical question of whether Roblin's remains should be treated with more respect and rather than traded as a fairground curiosity. Roblin's skull is now in Pembroke Castle in a storeroom, but the rest of his skeleton has been lost. No one knows it's been lost since 1914. Now, Pembroke Castle once had a very fine museum. You would enter through the castle barbican, and on the left-hand side, there'd be a little windowless room with a room and then an antechamber. 2 rooms with no windows, very dark, dimly lit. I remember going there as a child in the 1970s and being a bit of a history freak. Anything to do with history and museums, even at a tender age, I went in. And a visit was always rewarded. You saw cannonballs from Cromwell's siege of 1648. You saw relics from the Wars of the Roses and even Roman finds from the time when it was occupied in the 3rd and 4th century AD. But what always struck me as being terrifying was steps leading to the anteroom and a case in darkness with a human skull pointing, looking out at you. And I can see the typed, primitive little label now saying, this is the skull of William Roblin. And we've got a picture of the skull, which is now in Pembroke Castle. I remember seeing the skull staring out at me. And when you're 10, it's pretty terrifying. I suppose it's terrifying at any age, but when you're 10, even more terrifying. But they've no record of how the skull of Roblin got to Pembroke Castle, and no record of where the rest of the skeleton is. So, as I said in my introduction, the notoriety of William Roblin in the annals of Pembrokeshire crime is assured, because he was the last person to suffer capital punishment in the county exactly 200 years ago today. He was undoubtedly a troubled man with undoubtedly a bad character and many demons, but perhaps we shouldn't overdo we shouldn't subscribe to the contemporary condemnation of him. He lived at a brutal time. He and his family paid a fearful price for the crime, which in retrospect we might call manslaughter rather than willful murder for which he was executed. He was perhaps not the complete monster of legend. Certainly the facts and issues to be found in the 1863 narrative makes the old story nowhere near cut as once we believed. So I really hope that was of interest to you. It's the first time I've ever tried a talk online, and I have a huge fund of other stories and tales and so forth, which may be offered online. But thank you so much for joining me this evening. Let's remember Roblin, and indeed let's remember his victim as well, because there were no winners in this story, just victims, especially the one who was murdered. But let's remember the events of 200 years ago today, because the thing about the past, it isn't just dry facts and dates. It's about human beings. When you remember the past as human beings with the same physiology as us, the same hopes, aspirations, dreams, fears, then we humanize the past. And that, friends, is what brings history to life. So thank you for joining me today, and I bid you all good evening.